in the interviewing process, it can be very confusing. What do you do, for instance, if you are asked an illegal interview question? Hi, everyone. This is Emily, the Career Catalyst, and I really want to walk you through these questions today because it can be so stressful if you're in the process of being interviewed and the question you get feels very invasive. So, before we get into that, let me just start by talking about what questions are illegal. In most places, essentially, an interviewer cannot ask you anything about your personal life. So, examples of illegal questions include things like, how old are you? Where were you originally born? What language do you speak at home? What religion are you? Are you married? Do you have children? Now, the gray area here is that depending on where you live, there are also questions regarding things like gender identity and sexual romantic orientation that are possibly legal, possibly not. And so figure out kind of what the laws are around where you live, because that will really impact how you deal with a lot of these questions. So then let's get into this a little bit more. How do illegal questions tend to come about? Well, it's not that unusual for the illegal question to be something that's kind of intended as a warm up, kind of. It's not intended as invasive, just kind of breaking the ice. So you'll hear this a lot. People will be just saying things like, oh my God, my kids are stressing me out so much today. They're driving me crazy. I love them, but sometimes I want to strangle them. Do you have kids? So these kinds of questions you're going to handle, I think, a little bit differently than the questions that are really intended to be a little bit more boundary pushing. What I generally recommend for these kinds of questions is to kind of to change the topic a little bit as much as you can. You sort of a redirect, right? So if the person says, oh, my husband was making me crazy, are you married? You can say something like, what does your husband do? Right? Or how old are your kids? Things like that that are kind of a soft redirect and take the pressure off of you. Now, again, depending on where you live, the legality of these questions regarding things like gender identity and sexual romantic orientation can change a lot. I will say that that is not typically the kind of question that gets asked in this kind of warm up kind of situation. What do you do, though, if the question feels a little bit more uncomfortable? Let's say you're in the interview and the questioner says something like, so, yeah, this is a demanding job. Do you have kids? What you'll want to do in a perfect world is something like a little bit of figuring out what's behind it, right? So instead of saying, I mean, you can't always say, that's none of your concern, always an option. However, I would recommend something a little bit more like pause, take your time to gather your thoughts. I am able to work some evenings and weekends if that's what you're asking. I would just need a certain amount of advance notice. How often does that come up? So, a way to kind of answer what we think is probably behind the illegal question. You also have the option, as I said, to really say that's not any of your concern. It does potentially provide a little bit of risk there just because the person might take it amiss. That said, if the question feels very, very invasive, sometimes it's okay just to decide that that's enough of a red flag that you are unlikely to want to work at this workplace. So up to you, kind of how you handle that. If the question feels a little bit more invasive, then just kind of use your best judgment. Now, the third option, of course, is always simply to answer the question. And a lot of this, I get a lot of reports of this from people who are just kind of caught flat footed in the interview process, right? So the interviewer will say something like, and where are you originally from? And the person will simply answer, right? If you do that, try not to beat yourself up. The reason, though, that these questions are illegal is that they're potentially things that could be used to discriminate against you. And so, this is really why, if you can, I recommend a little bit of deflection or non answering of these questions. The other thing is, as I kind of mentioned earlier, as you're getting these questions, make a note of anything that feels super invasive or very uncomfortable because you're going to want to think through that after the interview ends. If you've been asked a lot of things that don't feel super good to you, chatting with someone and the person says, wait, do you have a disability, for instance? Or, are you a dude or a chick? Right? Those kinds of questions you are absolutely welcome to kind of put in the hopper there and consider after the fact because you don't have to feel pressured to take any job that is offered to you. And in an instance where it feels very much like the interviewer is making judgments about you based on your personal life, you may decide that that is simply not a good fit job. And that's regardless of whether questions around those kinds of things are legal where you live or not. So pay attention to it, pay attention to how you're feeling about it. One of the tips I often offer to people is as you're going in for an interview, have a way to take your own notes. I'm a little bit old school. I like just a pen and paper. If that isn't an option for you for whatever reason, do something that's easy to use. So, ideally, more of a tablet, for instance, than a phone. A phone can look very distracting if you're just kind of taking notes on it because you have to be kind of hovered over it and holding it. And so, something that's a little bit larger, a little bit easier to take your notes is better. And what you'll want to do is capture the emotions you're feeling at the time. You don't have to say, like, this question made me uncomfortable. But as you have an emotional reaction to an interview question or to something that the interviewer says, write it down. I actually have a really good example of this. I was actually on the other side of it. I was interviewing a candidate. And at the time, I was working in higher education, and my office was located next door to the campus LGBTQI plus student services office. And because of that, because of also social justicey things, I was asking each candidate who came in questions about their experience dealing with students who identify as GLBTQI+. And I was interviewing with a colleague, and we would have kind of both supervised this individual. One of the candidates that we interviewed said something like, it was okay with her if people made that lifestyle choice. Now, in the moment, because of what's going on, the stress of the interview, the kind of multiple things that you're concentrating on in the process of an interview, all I noted in that moment was that something about that answer didn't sit right with me. And so I wrote it down. I wrote down what she said, the best of my ability to capture it. And then afterwards, my co interviewer was very enthusiastic, saying, oh, this person is great. We should totally hire her. And I said, hang on, I need time to reflect on this. And I went back and I read through my notes. And I came back to my co interviewer and I said, I'm not okay hiring this person. She said that it's a lifestyle choice. I can't work through that. That's too big an issue. And my co interviewer said, well, I didn't hear her say that. And I said, I wrote it down. There isn't a reason I would have written that down if she hadn't said it. So all I knew in that moment was that something about that answer felt wrong to me. It felt uncomfortable. It felt icky. So I wrote it down. And so you'll find things like this where things just make you feel a little bit uncomfortable or the tone of the question is a little bit off, whatever it is. And this is why it's so important to have your own way to keep notes as you're going through this process. Now, of course, the tip is you don't want to be so focused on your notes, either the things you've written down that you want to say to them or concerns or answers to their questions, whatever. Do feel free to take those notes, but do make sure as you're taking notes that you are, as well as you can, doing things like making eye contact with the recruiters or whoever's interviewing you so that they really get the sense of kind of connecting with you as a person. Now, if eye contact is difficult for you, that's a topic for a later date, but do let me know in the comments and I can certainly talk through what some of the typical issues around eye contact can be. The point is you want to try to connect with these folks on as human a level as possible, but do note any of those things that really make you uncomfortable. And again, remember that any question that feels very personal, very invasive, very much about you as a human being and kind of your life outside of work, those are the questions that are likely to be illegal. And I would recommend you think through some of the ways that you would answer these questions just in case they get asked. It's not unusual for people at smaller organizations to be a little bit less up to date on kind of legalities and so forth. Or if you're dealing with people who don't normally interview. I had a friend who was recently asked by a student in an interview, a college student, how old he is. And, it's just because this person was a student and wasn't really aware of the legalities around questions like that. So think through some of these things and figure out how you would approach these answers to these illegal questions. And let me know in the chat below if you have any questions about any of this, and I will see you next time.